Okay, basically, what I have intended to do tonight is to a little bit talk about how to deal with complexity, but specifically lessons learned from aviation. And for that, I'm going to engage you in what is known as analogous learning. So first, I'm going to say a few words about what analogous learning is all about. But before I do that, the premise of my talk is to answer this question, which is what the hell is going on? And that is followed by arguing that there is a rising complexity, which makes things very difficult, and specifically some of the things that the management has been doing successfully in the past 30 years is not going to work going forward. And this is a quote, by the way, from the source of all knowledge, management knowledge in the world, namely Harvard Business Review. So you have to accept it. Now, the other thing that I like to argue is this, that the proficiency to make effective decisions for improved performance in dynamic complexity is lacking. Much of what we have experienced in the past and been taught to, they are all kind of going to create problems when we are dealing with complexity. And the other thing is this, that, this quote, like pilots on the flight deck, executives and managers are continuously making decisions, but unlike the pilots, they are rarely supported by systems that help them navigate the permanent white water in today's environment. So let's start with what is meant by analogous learning. Okay. So it's defined as discovering commonalities in the most uncommon places, or quite simply learning from situations and people that are different from your own but share similar attributes. Now, I searched the web and I came up this very interesting article, which has a great, example of what is meant by analogous learning. And the story here goes, you have to look at the pictures. The story goes that this train, which is called, I'm always bad at pronouncing name, but apparently it's Shinkansen bullet train, which is operating in Japan, which they had problems with it because it goes so fast that when it enters and leaves the tunnel, straightforward travel, it creates a sonic boom. And the engineers couldn't really understand why this is happening until somebody said that, let us look at this bird, which is called kingfisher bird. And kingfisher bird is the bird that, vertically drops down into the water and catches the fish. And what they found out, and was, kind of very surprising for them, was how little the, going from air into the water causes disturbances in the water. So as a result of that, they decided to change the shape of the bullet train into what you can see right now. So how did I, get into trying to connect, organizational environment to aviation and all that. It started with me when I was a student at the program at the Wharton School. We had two professors, namely Eric Triss and Fred Emery, that they had published a paper called Causal Texture of Organizational Environment in 1965. Now, I was a student in early 80s over there, so we had to study this paper. And basically, the paper argued that if you're dealing with organizational change, you really have to, because organizations, they exist in their environmental context, you have to understand that context. And, you have to appreciate that it's moving towards complexity. So, I also looked at this 2x2 typology, which, as you can see, that they had, on one axis, they had the complexity and the other dynamism. And as you can see, they placed turbulence into that high, high complexity and high dynamism on the type. So therefore, that was one thing that, got me to think, like, why can't we, what's the difference? This concept of turbulence using in organizational realm, is it the same as what is being used in aviation or not? And what is there that we could learn from it? Now, when I posted that on my Facebook, I got a note from Professor David Hawk, who used to, I guess, he was a student as well, but a few years before me, and he knew Eric Triss very well. And he said 2 points. Much of what, Eric Triss wrote, I guess, about turbulence, which is very interesting, came from Eric, where he hit on the idea of turbulence while on a plane ride from New York to London. And, apparently there was a person or people, falling down and so forth. And he kind of got the idea that this might be some useful concept to be applied to the organizational environment. And also, as I started doing research about this subject, I came across quite a few papers that they argued that turbulence in organization is like a new metaphor for organizational research, because you have to understand how do environmental turbulence and complexity affect the appropriate formal design of organizations. So that was something that basically got me connected to, from organizational environment, turbulence, to aviation. Next thing, it was realization that two strands of thought are coming together that have one thing in common, namely complexity. And I have a story to tell you here. The person who's most responsible to bring to our attention in today's world, as it relates to the organizational environments, is no other than Dave Snowden. And you see his picture over there. Now, I had read a paper by Snowden and Kurtz in 2002, but it wasn't until I was at a conference in New Zealand that he was the keynote speaker, and I listened carefully to what he was saying, that it got me really hooked to the concept. And I saw the concept that he was developing is going to be extremely helpful for the people who are in the field of management. Now, if you haven't had a chance to read this paper, I urge you to read the Harvard Business Review 2007 paper, which is called A Leader's Framework for Decision Making. Now, he, and I guess his colleagues, they developed this framework, which is so hard to pronounce because it's a Welsh name, but I guess it's pronounced something like Cynefin. And the argument here is this, that the environment for decision-making, the context for decision-making for the management is not the same. There are at least 4 different contexts, and he called them, obvious, complicated, complex, and chaotic. And the way that he came to distinguish among these things was to use how much cause and effect are, present, how much they are visible to the decision maker. How can you truly understand? Like, for instance, in the obvious or the simple case, he says that, everybody knows that if we have this effect, whatever that is, symptom or something, we know that this has caused it. And, we always go and try to find who is doing that particular, function better. And we learn, and, he says it's the domain of best practices. Now, when it comes to complicated, it's very hard. It's much harder to understand what is causing the effect, because there might be multiplicity of causes. And it might require a certain knowledge that we don't have it. So this is where he calls, it's the domain of, in which he calls it known unknowns. So there is something that you want to do, you know what it is, but you don't know how to do it. So you appeal to expertise. Somebody is an expert out there who can help you with it. And he calls that whole domain as complicated. Now, when it comes to, and by the way, complicated and obvious, they're both in the ordered side of the things. But now he moves into the so-called unordered, environments, and complex and chaotic are the two that become extremely important, especially the complex. And in the complex, as you can see, there's, again, multiplicity of causes, a lot of different effects. It's very hard to discern what's going on. And this is where he argues that the response to your challenges in such environment is in the domain of emergence, which means that you have to have bunch of people that they are putting their heads together and developing a response. Now, I'm going to show you later that what kind of organization might be helpful. And then you've got chaotic, which is, it's hopelessness, but, there's not much you can do, but still you have to make the decisions, and you have to do it rapidly and then sit and wait what's going on. Now, in the meantime, we also had this whole thing about the so-called VUCA, environment, which is, stands for, I'm sure that most of you know, is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And again, this is another framework that tells you that the environment in which you are working is very, very hard to understand. And once you don't understand your environment, it's very hard to develop a strategy or plan of action. So putting the two together, we came to this conclusion that one thing which is very powerful here is this, that really one size does not fit all. And the value of this framework as a sense-making framework lies in helping system decision makers understand approximately where their systems lie among these domains, and by extension, what kind of tools, approaches, processes, or methods are more likely to work successfully in a given system. This is tremendously important because we also had a program on strategic consulting that we look into the performance of the consultants. And although billions and billions of dollars being spent in consulting, the results are not really commensurate with the money that is spent. So one other, thing that you get out of studying the work of Snowden is this, that there is a need for diverse thinking. You cannot use one kind of thinking, which is basically most of us who have studied, in programs such as MBA or other management. It's usually the thinking is reductionistic or analytical thinking. And the key thing to take out of this discussion is this, that again, remember, one size does not fit all. So what we did here, we thought that this Cynefin framework can help us also to decide which models of consulting is appropriate for each of those domains. So to give you an example, we already talked that in the complicated is an expert model. In the in the complex, no doubt, we argue that it's the process model, because you got to engage a whole bunch of people, what we call requisite minds, in order to develop a response, to the challenge. Now, we also looked at, the type of tools that are and methods that are out there, namely qualitative and quantitative, as well as whether they're used strategically or tactically. And when we populated this simple 2x2 matrix, it showed us that most of the approaches that are taken and the tools and the methods that are used, they rely on, they're tactical and mostly are quantitative. I venture to say that within my own field, that systems dynamics is one of those, tactical and quantitative ones. Nothing, bad about it, but you have to realize that whether that is something that is going to help you when you are, for instance, in a complex situation, because that particular approach relies on you being able to model the situations. And I think that you will agree with me that if something is that complex, it's virtually impossible to model it. Now, next thing, I started looking and asking myself, back to aviation, what really happens when you are in turbulence? Okay, and what is turbulence? Well, everybody knows that it's something to do with plane encountering some kind of a rough air, but there are different grades or shades of turbulence, like for instance, you have light turbulence, you have moderate turbulence, and then you have severe turbulence, and you have extreme turbulence. Now here, I would like very much to share with you a very short video that will give you what extreme turbulence means. And I like to argue that I bet that the same, it's a feeling, okay, that the same thing happens when the organization hits extreme turbulence. Like in my book, I think those people who initially work in the pandemic area, they were experiencing extreme turbulence. So let us look at this, if I can get it working. Okay.
Who should we trust with our health care? Here are the facts. Mehmet Oz got rich pushing phony medical advice on TV. No wonder he wants to privatize Medicare and let the cost of prescription drugs go even higher. It's simple. Oz fights for them. Betterment fights for us.
Okay. Okay. This is what happens when you hit extreme turbulence.
There's the signs. There goes the fence. Holy cow.
Okay, so as you can see, the situation is very dire in that plane. Now, I found some that they show you extreme turbulence when a passenger jet hits it. I didn't want to play it because, after playing it, it's so scary because a lot of people get badly injured, including the cabin crew, because the one that I have is a sudden, encounter with what they call clear air turbulence, which is not visible to your instruments. But anyway, I hope that you get the point. When you are in that condition, it's virtually impossible to do anything because everything is moving, you're moving, it's just, and you can't fight those situations. You just have to try to at least, stabilize yourself. And you can see that they're trying to fasten, make seat belts tighter and do all kinds of different things. Now, we also, what we did, we took, again, we took the Kuhneman framework and we superimposed these different, shades of turbulence on these different things. So, for instance, complexity is like when you hit the severe turbulence. Now, these are all obviously different, attempts to try to get thinking, because you can use these analogies to think. Now, here, everybody, once you talk about complex systems and complexity, they ask, how do you define it? And the definition that we are using is from Professor Jackson, who is a well-known individual within the field of systems thinking, and his book Critical Systems Thinking and the Management of Complexity says that what makes something complex is the number of parts and the ways in which they interact. And also there has to be a large number of elements, as well as many interactions. And the trouble is this, that you don't know how they're going to interact with one another and what, structure is going to get, built through those interactions. So you have, like sense of lack of understanding. Now, complexity is the property of complex systems. And it's, in this sense, we are using it more as a way of thinking, and not, trying to use mathematical models and calculations to come up with some answers as to what they are. Now, using Kuhneman framework can help executives sense which context they are in, so that they cannot make better decisions, but also avoid the problems that arise from when their preferred management style causes them to make mistakes. Now, it's very important, to basically appreciate that, complexity today is more, there's more complexity out there in whatever that we are doing. And therefore, we have to, start understanding as much as we can as to what that complexity is. Now, Snowden calls his framework as a sense-making framework, because one of the things that people always ask us when you show them all those different, what he calls habitat, how do you tell us where we are, where our organization is situated? Now, they have Kuhneman, the organization, they have developed a very elaborate sense-making mechanisms, but us, we think that, and we have applied situation awareness model from Aviation, which you can look up. I think the best explanation of situation awareness model is actually in Wikipedia. So, the other thing that I keep on, the more I read about this stuff and the more I work with them and apply them, the more I understand that this whole notion of managing complexity is not the correct conception to be used. You can't manage it, but you can navigate complexity. I'm sure that some of you are going to try to disagree with me. But anyways, now, the other question was, like we saw, the manifestation of complexity in that aeroplane that I showed you, what was happening to the people, to the equipment, everything. Now, you ask yourself, if you are in a, that realm of complexity and all that, what do you feel? What is the manifestation of that? Now, this was a result of a research done, which says that when you are in that situation, for the management, for the people at the helm, it is not clear which activities are relevant. Is not apparent how or to what extent these activities are independent, and especially the environment of decision maker appears ill-structured, dynamic, and uncertain. I think that, if you look at carefully at what's happening right now in the world, that is how you're gonna feel about your environment. Now, I also found two very interesting, examples to give you a sense of what is it that we are talking about. What would we experience if we are encountering this, complexity, especially, like extreme complexity and all that. Well, the first one is, it says when an earthquake strikes, social infrastructure goes into state of shock, and the first job of the authorities is to get things back up and running. And this is where, they're confronted with this incredible complexity as to what to do. Right now, if you look at the videos out of Florida with the, Hurricane Ian, same thing. Now, as it relates to the organization, the example was cited in this book is this, that imagine a blue chip company riding a prolonged wave of competitive advantage, suddenly runs smack into disruptive technology that is creating discontinuity in its traditional market. Stock price crumbles, analysts call, partners defect, employees resign, competitors gloat, customers hedge, and investors demand action. I'm sure that, again, in our program, we always had students to study the companies, major companies that they had failed and why. And, part of it is because they did not appreciate the environment, the context in which they were making decisions. Now, in aviation, there is a model called SHELL, or SHELL, which stands for software, hardware, environment, and liveware. Now, software and hardware and environment are pretty easy to explain. Liveware is all the humans in the system that are working, in the aviation industry, or for this particular, let's say, that company. Now, it's very important that you use that as a basis to try to come up with an optimum design for the system. So you cannot maximize any one of them at the expense of the others. Now, we believe that the same model could be applied to the design of so-called, social systems, and we have done it. We have done it in places, like we did work for a major refinery. They were trying to develop a vulnerability model, and everybody was focusing, reductionistic approach, breaking it into different parts and then examining each part taken separately. When we brought in this whole conception, that apply systems thinking, look at the whole, look at how the parts are interacting, we found out that the biggest, possibility and probability of mishap is going to be in the interface of two different things, namely the planning department and the front, which otherwise you could not have if you had not looked at the whole thing and how the parts were interacting. Now, obviously, we talk a lot about, complex adaptive and complex, you hear a lot, complex adaptive and complex evolving systems. Now, complex evolving systems, as it says here, grew out of somewhat simpler concept of complex adaptive system, which basically evolving, as the name implies, is constantly, trying to change itself. Now, I don't know. I haven't, taken a deep dive, but I'm sure that, COVID is a complex evolving system, because every time I watch the news, they say there is a new whatever of COVID. So it's evolving. Now, in complexity theory, putting all the things that you learn into one picture, it says that you have interactive elements, non-linearity, the whole is greater than the parts, evolution in the system is irreversible, hindsight does not lead to foresight, and this is important, you cannot forecast. When you're dealing with non-linear systems, it's virtually impossible to forecast. Now, you might be able to, anticipate a few things, happening here and there, but you cannot sit here and forecast. Now, some of the, again, looking at the literature on aviation, some of the things that are, like well understood and taken by that industry and not by the business, is this so-called counterintuitive behavior. Now, I use the definition from the book Systems Thinking by our, colleague, mentor, friend, Jamshid Garajadawi, who defines it as the, actions intended to produce a desired outcome that may generate opposite results. This is a very important concept. Not many people understand it or look for it. Now, several years ago, with Dr. Akoff, we were writing this paper about downsizing. He was totally against it, because he used to say that downsizing is very counterintuitive, in the sense that short time, it gives you some results, but in the long run, it doesn't. And he used to say that, this is because the way management looks at, especially at profit, especially at stock price, because, you say that performance is a function of profits and expenses. Now, management always, at times when things are very difficult, they find it impossible to do anything with the revenues. So what do? They go and look into the expenses side. And in the expense side, the thing that is they consider more controllable and easy for them to do something about it is the labor cost. Now, we found that actually, for instance, Toyota never did that. Toyota found out that, they had to take out 6% of the cost out of their, cars, instead of trying to, which that 6% would, let's say translate to 1,200 people or whatever. Instead of trying to downsize, fire those people, they went to the same people and took the problem to them and said, this is our problem. What can we do? We don't want to, have anybody fired from this company. And guess what? The people went back, they put their heads together, they came back with the redesign of certain parts of the cars that it gave them 14% advantage. That's the difference, 6% versus, or for instance, I saw one of the stories that is unbelievable is what they call a Qantas Flight 72 from Singapore, to Perth. And this flight was operated, the type of the aircraft was Airbus 330-300. As soon as they got out of the airspace of Singapore, the plane started, acting weirdly, so the nose all of a sudden would go down, then it would go up and all that stuff. Now, the captain in charge who saved, God knows, I think 200 and some lives on board was a fellow called Captain Sullivan, who basically, and I took that quote from him because he's also in YouTube, and also he has this fantastic book, which he says that instinctively, I release my pressure on the sight stick. Out of my subconscious, a survival technique from a previous life emerges. Neutralize, I'm not in control, so I must neutralize controls. I never imagined I would use this part of my military experience. Now, he used to be a Top Gun with the US Air Force, and then, they sent him to Australia, and basically he stayed there, lived there, and he became a, senior pilot with Qantas. But what's interesting is this, that, naturally, when plane starts moving up or down or sideways, you try to use the controls, the stick or the yoke or whatever. And he says that at times like this, it's very counterintuitive. Don't do anything. Let the plane see what it's going to do. It will stabilize itself. Anyways, I'm getting too excited. Now, the other thing which is becoming very, very important in all the systems, all the conversation and discourse with aviation and everything else, is to build resilience. Now, what is resilience? It's the simplest form, the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties and toughness. Now, what's important here is to make a distinction between resilience and robustness. Robustness is more about how we respond to the challenges when they are ways that we were trained in and we have the skills, okay? But resilience is more about how to go beyond that and how we continuously adapt to changing situations for which we may not necessarily have procedures. This is where you have to use your creativity and so forth. I'm sorry, I'm going a little faster because I'm a little behind. Now, let me go to this. Now, this is something that was posted by McKinsey and Company about 3 days ago, whatever, on LinkedIn, which talks about, raising resilience in your organization. And they talk that the 4 components that are very important to pay attention to is agility, empowered teams, talent and culture, and then adaptable leaders. Now, this first, the adaptable leaders is becoming extremely, prevalent in the literature in management, because everybody is arguing in today's world, and with all this complexity, everything, you need to have leaders who have agility in thinking, meaning that they do not, have this dogmatic way of looking at things. Just because, we used to look at this way, therefore we have to do. No, you have to change your thinking. Now, I don't have time, but I wanted to share with you what is known as miracle on Northwest Airlines Flight 85, how 4 pilots saved 404 passengers. Now, our thinking and argument is this, that organizations like in aviation, they should start creating these networks of what they call possibilities parallel to their hierarchical structures. In the networks, in those nodes, you're going to invite people who have cognitive abilities to do critical thinking and to become, to be able to provide innovative solutions. Novelty is the name of the game. And you know, you use on the left-hand side, you use specialty silos only for implementation. This, you know, like Dave Snowden talks about, you know, like distributed cognition. Well, this is distributed cognition. Then he talks about, you know, like how, you know, the response has to emerge out of the interaction of these nodes together. So now you hear a lot about agility, agile organization, but these days it's more about agile thinking, okay? And what is agile thinking, especially in aviation? It's the ability to actively switch your thinking according to what's needed across different contexts. It is a proven thing. We've seen it in the past. When the plane hits, you know, some extreme complexity, now whether it's weather related or whether it's mechanical or whatever, most of the time those challenges are unique and they're not, you know, somewhere where you could go and open the book and say that, you know, I'm going to be, you know, I'm going to use this out of the book and it's going to solve the problem. It doesn't do it. The Flight 85 that I wanted to talk, and plus other things, I can show it to you, that lives were saved because the pilots, now fortunately in both Qantas, you know, that Superjet A380 out of Singapore and Northwest 85, they had 4 or 5 experienced pilot in the cockpit or on the flight deck. And they formed this distributed cognition network and started working together. Now on the Superjet, the thing that I really admire is when the captain in command, he said that, folks, stop telling me what is not working. Tell me what is working. He shifted the paradigm. You know, we said that aviation is a complex adaptive system. It adapts to the situations. It learns from the experience. You look at, I have to knock on wood, you look at the results here in this country. What is it now? Over, what is it, 2 years or even more? We haven't had any mishaps where we have fatalities. This is all because, now compare this with 30 years ago. If you plot all these things, you see that the learning in this industry has been exponential. Now, one of the things that is something that is also related to what I have so far discussed is the model that was developed for the aviation to train pilots, which actually, believe it or not, is called DECIDE model, which is, you know, detect, estimate, choose, identify, do, and evaluate. Now, the strength of the aviation system is in ability to detect and correct errors. And as a result, learn from them and change the system. Now, the key components of this, you know, detection and correction of errors are, you know them, black boxes, and then specifically the role of one agency, which is called National Transportation Safety Board, which are incredible. It's the only agency inside the government of the United States that has no authority on anybody else. And yet more than 85% of its recommendations are carried out, are implemented. Why? Because of the respect for the professionalism of these people who work in that system. Now, it's very important that if there are accidents, we have, lessons learned system that other pilots can, access and use it. The one thing that planes have and organizations in general don't have is the scanning and surveillance. Now, remember that on the plane, you have this function, which is, your weather, what is it? The weather forecasting system, the instrument that you have, which weather radar that tells you what to expect in front of you. Of course, there are situations which they call them clear air turbulence, which are not amenable to that kind of, we still don't have any, system that we can put it in the plane and correctly to tell us that there is a, they call them cat, is in front of us. But nevertheless, we have pilots, they have this whole incredible network that is helping them. Like for instance, I keep on going to that because it's so interesting, that Flight 85 Northwest, when they found out that the plane all of a sudden, flying straight, all of a sudden it rolled to the left by about 40 degrees. And they didn't know what was happening. The initial guess was that they have lost one or two of the engines. But, they checked the engines were working all right. So anyway, they had to apply the opposite rudder to keep the plane a little bit this way. And then they started playing with asymmetric, whatever throttle thing, so that you put more trust in one side of the plane to the now. But they were so worried that this cannot continue. And where they were, it was right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, because the flight was going from Detroit to Narita Airport in Tokyo. And they were in a zone which is, it's like a dead zone as it relates to communications. There's nothing there that you could communicate. So what they did, they formed a network. This is beautiful, with the other planes. And they started asking them, like, are you closer to whatever? Because they decided that they're going to go back to Anchorage. But they never knew whether they're going to make it or not. The next thing, they tried via, again, their network to get in touch with the support inside the, facilities in wherever, Minnesota, somewhere they had. So anyways, I can go for hours and hours because I think it's the same thing could be developed and applied to organizations, but it needs a willingness to change. So my friends, that's it. I hope I didn't bore you. I hope that you got something out of this presentation.